Well, we know that social capital is on the decline globally. Sociologists suggest that this connectedness is a primary contributor to a person's sense of well-being. It's shaped by our local daily life. Christians call a comprehensive well-being shalom, the flourishing of life. So if God's grand global project is the restoration and flourishing of all people and all places, and that we're to contribute, to be co-producers with God in his definition of human thriving, what is our part in helping others live well, in becoming more human? And could it be that our own flourishing is tied to the flourishing of our neighbors and places? Seek the welfare of the city for your own welfare, to love God by loving your neighbor. God is clearly concerned with communal well-being. I've become convinced that it is the local neighborhood that is the context which people and the shalom of God flourishes. So how do we respond to the trend of living above place versus being rooted, and the trend of valuing the private over the common, of the increasing isolation and fragmentation and speed of life? How do we live out our faith, not as professionals, but as neighbors? And so for my own journey, I want to talk about deceptively simple ideas that maybe, if they got rooted into practices, could be seeds that help us and others live well. And because city shapes culture, I'm especially interested in how faith informs our urban lifestyle and what is good news to my neighbors in Vancouver. Personally, I've had a convergence of issues peaked for me about 7 years ago. I wanted to live more deeply into my faith in ways that are a tangible blessing to others, since Christianity is primarily a lifestyle, not a system of beliefs. And I also personally longed for a deeper experience of community, so I began a process of reorienting my entire way of life within the proximity of the neighborhood. My imagination was sparked for another way of living and being, and some would say is profound in its simplicity and staggering in its scope. I took the first step and leap and moved into a 100-year-old house with 6 bedrooms. It's on Parker Street, so from the beginning we called it Parker House as a way to affirm place. The incarnation means that place matters, so I'm rooting in for the rest of my life. Walter Brueggemann suggests that the core human need is not meaninglessness, but rootlessness. As I was experimenting in new ways to financially sustain myself, I began offering a few rooms to rent. In the process, I discovered a need to hold space for people in transition, what some call postmodern homeless. I eventually opened up all the rooms and invited them to stay as long as they wanted. There's now been over 200 people that have lived in my home in the last 5 years. And I've lived a good amount of my life alone, and now I don't even have a bedroom door. It's a lofted bedroom. So it's a miracle of grace that I love this. I moved away from a privatized way of living where your home is seen as a sanctuary to the place of making your personal possessions more public, as Augustine argued for. People in need or moving into town or in between, I'd pray, and ask God to edit. It's amazing what Jesus and Craigslist can orchestrate. It's wildly diverse and filled with amazing encounters and deep joy. Most would say that they have tasted of home where they are accepted and welcomed and invited to live well. I quickly learned that you can't be present and be busy, so I spent the first year and a half learning a radically foreign rhythm that had enough margin. I stopped using the word busy so I would stop increasing its value. It's very people intense and full, but I no longer live on adrenaline and deadlines, which I did most of my life. So now my litmus test is if I'm irritated when I'm interrupted, I know I've moved back into busy mode. I've actually wondered if busyness moves us to live out of scarcity, which leads to anxiety and fear, instead of living out of God's abundance. This has been a slow conversion towards slower living in the city. I'm now able to live 90% of my life within a 30-minute walk of the house. I feel like I should apologize for that because I know for many that's not possible, but I wonder. Because I think living large comes from living small. Yep, there's been lots of hard choices and compromises that were made. And for me, though, integrated living has been worth it. For most of my life, I embraced the value of self-sufficiency and independence. What a delusion they are, hey? Now, most of my life is shared, not with family, but with strangers. My car and home and food and resources and possessions and time. It is wonderful and hard and beautiful, and I would never go back. For years, I wrestled with the ideas of singles living alone as a communal people. So this was an intentional move to risk living into my faith more deeply. I now live with 5 to 6 others in the house. There was 9 in the summer, a bit too many. We share meals as a household several times a week. I find so many people are in the practice of eating alone or in restaurants. But food builds relationships. A lifestyle of generous hospitality where Jesus is the guest and host is always mutually transformative. I moved from a compartmentalized practice of entertaining just friends and family to a lifestyle of radical hospitality to strangers and neighbors. A year and a half ago, I started monthly soup nights for the neighborhood. I made a couple pots of homemade soup and bread. Last month, I had 47 of my immediate neighbors, every decade from mid-20s to 70s. Most people tend to gather with their tribes. Even churches are tribes. So people have loved it. Where else like the neighborhood can such diversity gather? I haven't been able to think of anything else. Neighbors who have lived next door to each other for 15 years and never met till they came to my house have now exchanged emails and even house keys. I think it's a taste of the shalom of God. I've received neighborhood small grants from the Vancouver Foundation. They know the power of small efforts. What if churches started budgeting into this kind of work? I volunteer at most key community events. I'm always surprised there's rarely Christians involved. In my home, I try to offer for all kinds of gathering. Halloween last year was another reason to throw a party. I think Christians should be known as the most ones that throw parties. I live in an area with the highest concentration of artists in the country, so I've opened my home for house concerts. I've hosted over 15. How can we make our homes more public? Neighborliness seems to have become a lost art. The simple, ordinary practices that enable a community to flourish tend to be diminished in value when we don't depend on each other practically, and productivity and dehumanizing efficiency dominate our lives. The idea of neighborhood or parish helps me think about fostering a sense of village, whereas Peter Block suggests every gift can be given. Neighborliness deepens our connection to place and nurtures compassion. It provides a social fabric that increases stability. Alan Hirsch reminds us that to connect in our neighborhood, we need proximity, frequency, and spontaneity, all within each margin. I've sought to root deeply into my neighborhood, seeking to be a faithful presence. I'm not advocating that everyone lives at this level of intensity. I mean, I'm doing this full time. G.K. Chesterton said that we're to exaggerate what the world has neglected. So I feel like part of my call is to exaggerate maybe what has been neglected in the area of radical hospitality, to maybe spark a few others to imagine with me. What if every neighborhood had a catalyst for inclusive hospitality, a lifestyle that nurtured a web of care in their place and breathed shalom into their neighborhood? One neighbor asked me to do her living will. It prompted me to dream about my neighborhood functioning like an extended family. What would it take to develop enough connection and shared life that you cared about each other in the neighborhood like an extended family? What if every empty bed in Christian homes were made available to people on the street? What if we didn't think as professionals providing services and didn't see our neighbors as projects or people to be served or witnessed to, but simply invited them into our lives as friends, like Jesus does? What if we took seriously that to love God is to love your immediate neighbors? To enjoy God is to enjoy your neighbors. What if we all lived well by loving our neighbors well? Thank you.